The ledger was 3 coppers short. The ale barrels were leaking, and my left boot was slowly filling with frontier mud. It was a perfectly normal Tuesday at the trading post, until a ridiculously gilded royal carriage sank up to its axles in my front yard. I didn't bow. I just gripped my heavy wooden ledger and watched. Out stepped the legendary King Cormac, a towering mountain of a man dripping in velvet. The entire kingdom whispered about his terrifying, silent dominance. I watched this supposed terror take exactly 2 steps into my yard before freezing. Barnaby, my most violently territorial rooster, was blocking his path. The king of the realm stared at the poultry. Barnaby flapped his wings and let out a demonic screech. Cormac, the ruthless ruler of our kind, visibly flinched, took a hasty step back, and tripped spectacularly over his own ceremonial cape. He caught himself on a mud-splattered post, looking frantic. Before I could even laugh, a sour-faced counselor materialized beside him, ignoring the chicken entirely. "Sire, we must settle the southern borders. The Duchess awaits your hand in marriage. You cannot delay the ceremony any longer." "I cannot marry the Duchess!" Cormac blurted out, his deep voice cracking slightly. "And why not, sire?" the counselor sneered, stepping carefully around a puddle. "Have you suddenly found a suitable partner in this swamp?" Cormac looked wildly around the courtyard, his panicked eyes locked onto mine. I was standing on the porch, gripping my ledger, completely covered in flour and dirt. He threw a desperate finger in my direction. "Yes, her! She's the one!" Chapter 1. The courtyard went so utterly silent that I could hear a single drop of ale hit the mud from the leaking barrel beside me. Every eye in the royal procession slowly turned from the panicked king to me. I stood frozen on the porch of my trading post, a smear of flour across my cheek and a heavy oak accounting ledger pressed against my chest. The sour-faced counselor adjusted his absurdly large velvet collar, staring at me as if I were a particularly offensive species of fungus. "Her, sire? This proprietor?" Cormac nodded frantically, his massive shoulders tense under his royal tunic. "Yes, exactly. My fated. We are intensely connected." I blinked. Once. Twice. And then my survival instinct, which exclusively consisted of biting sarcasm and a deep-seated refusal to let anyone dictate my life, took the wheel entirely. "I have literally never seen this man before in my life," I shouted, my voice slicing through the thick, humid air of the frontier. The collective gasp from the royal guard was so dramatic, you would have thought I just kicked a puppy. "Silence, peasant," an armored guard barked, stepping forward with his hand resting threateningly on the pommel of his sword. "You dare call the sovereign a liar?" "I'm calling him a terrible liar," I corrected loudly, stepping off the porch. I didn't care that he was 7 feet of pure muscle. I didn't care that his bloodlines supposedly conquered the western plains. My territory ended at the timberline, and nobody, not even a king, was going to drag me into their political theater. "I am Lyra of the Southern Pass, and I am certainly not anyone's—" "Seize her for treason," the counselor shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. 2 heavily armored guards lunged forward. My flight response had always been notoriously absent. I didn't run. Instead, I planted my boots in the thick, squelching mud, raised my 6-pound iron-bound accounting ledger high above my head like a battle axe, and bared my teeth. "The first man who touches my apron gets a concussion," I roared, gripping the binding so hard my knuckles went white. The guards actually hesitated. I was vibrating with furious, adrenaline-fueled energy. I had fought off drunken merchants, feral hogs, and local thugs with this exact book. I was fully prepared to add royal knights to the list. "Stand down!" A booming, remarkably unsteady voice echoed across the yard. Cormac scrambled forward, his royal boots slipping slightly in the mud. He threw out his massive arms, physically placing himself between my raised ledger and the hesitant guards. Up close, he smelled absurdly expensive, like crushed pine, cold rain, and something faintly resembling sheer panic. The pure size of him blocking my path should have been intimidating. His broad back completely shielded me from the procession. But as he turned to face me, I didn't see a ruthless conqueror. I saw a man whose gaze was wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't puff up his chest to establish dominance. Instead, this towering, supposedly fearsome monarch ducked his head to avoid the sharp corner of my swinging ledger, dropped swiftly to one knee right into the muck, and leaned in so close I could feel the intense, overwhelming heat radiating from his skin. "Please," he desperately whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up at me. "Please, just play along for 5 minutes. I will pay you." Chapter 2. I kept the massive book suspended in the air for 3 agonizingly long seconds, my chest heaving before I finally lowered it. 5 minutes, I hissed, grabbing a fistful of his absurdly heavy velvet cloak and hauling the king of the realm toward the side entrance of the trading post. He scrambled up, his royal boots slipping wildly in the mud, and practically tumbled through the doorway after me. I slammed the heavy oak door shut, dropping the iron latch into place with a satisfying clack, instantly cutting off the outraged murmurs of the royal procession outside. My back room was not built for a monarch. It was built for storing spare ale casks, curing salted pork, and hiding from overly talkative merchants. The ceiling was low, the air smelled sharply of dried rosemary and wood smoke, and the space was incredibly narrow. Cormac took one step into the dim room, attempted to turn around, and drove his massive shoulder directly into my tallest shelving unit. A pyramid of pewter tankards collapsed instantly, clattering to the floorboards with a deafening crash. "I am," Cormac whispered, staring in absolute horror at the rolling metal cups. "I am so incredibly sorry." I leaned against the door, crossing my arms over my flour-stained apron. The adrenaline was still humming through my veins, making my fingertips buzz. I stared at him. The broad chest, the sharp jawline, the wild, dark hair that usually looked so intimidating on the royal coins. He looked like a terrified bear trapped in a pantry. "Speak," I commanded, entirely forgetting to add sire. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and carefully navigated around a sack of oats to put a small table between us. "My counsel," he began, his voice dropping to a frantic, rumbling whisper, "is attempting to force me into a mating ceremony with Duchess Genevieve. She is terrifying, Lyra." "She's a duchess," I deadpanned. "You are the king. Growl at her or something." "I don't growl," he shot back, looking deeply offended. "I mean, I can, biologically, but it feels incredibly rude in a social setting. The council thinks I am this brooding, silent conqueror because I rarely speak at meetings. The truth is, I don't speak because if I open my mouth, I usually say something foolish, and if I try to pace the room to look intimidating, I will inevitably trip over a rug and shatter a vase." I stared at him. The most feared alpha in a century, the man whose banners made warlords tremble, was currently hiding in my storeroom having a mild panic attack about his own clumsiness. "So, you pointed at the nearest woman holding a heavy object and claimed she was your fated mate to get out of a political marriage," I summarized flatly. "It was a moment of profound panic," he admitted, dragging a heavy hand down his face. "But if I walk back out there and admit I lied, the council will declare me unfit. They will force the marriage by nightfall. I need you to come to the capital. I need you to pretend to be my fiercely independent, completely unapproachable mate, just until I can secure my political allies and dissolve the council's authority." "Absolutely not," I said, pushing off the door. "I have a business to run. I am not playing royal dress-up." "I will fund your inn," he blurted out. I stopped. I had blueprints hidden under the floorboards of my bedroom. Blueprints for the grandest, most sprawling traveler's inn this side of the mountains. It would take me 30 years of selling stale bread and watered-down ale to afford the foundation. "How much?" I asked, my voice dangerously even. He didn't even blink. He reached into his tunic, pulled out a blank royal writ bearing the crest of the crown, and grabbed a charcoal stub from my inventory desk. He scribbled a number on the parchment that made my vision blur briefly, And full immunity from any treason charges stemming from whatever this is, I added, tapping the heavy ledger against my thigh. Done, he breathed, sliding the parchment across the scarred wooden table. I stepped forward. He was so large he completely blocked the only window in the room, casting us in shadow. The scent of him, rich, earthy pine and something undeniably electric, made my skin prickle strangely. I ignored it, chalking it up to the sheer absurdity of the situation. I reached out, grabbing the edge of the parchment. Deal. Deal, he agreed softly, and extended his massive hand. I gripped his palm. The very second our skin made contact, a violent, breathtaking jolt of pure heat snapped up my arm, shooting straight into my chest. It wasn't static. It felt like a physical strike, dragging a breathless gasp from my lungs as my inner wolf suddenly, violently threw itself against the cage of my ribs. Cormac's eyes blew wide, the gold of his wolf flashing brilliantly in the dim light. We violently snatched our hands back, both of us stumbling away from the table in mutual, absolute horror. Chapter 3. The royal courtyard looked less like a noble procession and more like a poorly organized hostage negotiation. Careful with that crate, I barked, pointing my favorite wooden stirring spoon at a heavily armored knight who was sweating profusely. That contains 5 years of tax records and the only legible recipe for salted plum jam in the Southern Territory. You drop it, and I will personally see that you scrub the latrines until winter. The knight, whose chest plate bore the ancient insignia of the royal vanguard, looked completely demoralized as he hoisted the wooden crate into the back of the luggage wagon. Standing near the carriage door, the sour-faced counselor looked as though he was actively chewing on a lemon. "Sire," he hissed, sidling up to Cormac. "This is highly irregular. The king's mate should travel with a dedicated retinue of ladies-in-waiting, not cast-iron skillets." Cormac stood rigidly by the carriage, trying very hard to project an aura of terrifying authority. "My mate," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "is a woman of practical means. We do not question the skillets, counselor." I threw a glance over my shoulder, catching the way Cormac's hands were clasped tightly behind his back. Since the terrifying electric jolt in the back room, neither of us had spoken a word to each other. We had simply stared at our own hands for a full minute before I aggressively cleared my throat, shoved the royal writ into my bodice, and marched outside to start packing. I refused to analyze it. It was static. It was the adrenaline. It was absolutely, unequivocally, not the biological recognition of a true mate. "All right," I announced, wiping a smudge of flour off my forehead with the back of my wrist. "The ledgers are loaded, the dry goods are secured, and I've nailed the front door of the trading post shut. Let's get this over with." The royal carriage was ridiculous. It was a massive, gilded monstrosity painted in the deep crimson and gold of the royal house, suspended on massive leather straps to supposedly absorb the bumps of the road. I hitched up my heavy wool skirts and climbed in, refusing the assistance of a hovering footman. The interior smelled aggressively of expensive leather and lavender oil. The seats were covered in tufted velvet that felt entirely too soft. I immediately claimed the forward-facing bench, dragging a small, heavy wooden lockbox of loose copper onto the cushion beside me to establish my territory. A moment later, the carriage dipped sharply on its suspension. Cormac ducked his head, maneuvering his massive frame through the door. The space instantly shrank. He was entirely too large for the plush interior, his broad shoulders practically brushing the window frames. He settled heavily onto the opposite bench, his knees spread slightly. Our knees were mere inches apart. The oppressive, heavy scent of him, pine and rain, filled the confined space, making my pulse jump erratically. "Comfortable?" I asked dryly, crossing my arms over my chest. "Perfectly," he lied, looking incredibly rigid. From outside, the head of the guard shouted a command. The heavy carriage doors were slammed shut, the latches sliding into place with a definitive metallic thud that locked us in from the outside. "They lock us in?" I demanded, my pulse spiking for an entirely different reason. What if there's a fire? What if I decide I want to walk? It is for security, Cormac muttered, his eyes darting toward the window. Protocol dictates the sovereign is sealed until we reach a secured checkpoint. The carriage driver cracked his whip. The horses lunged forward with a sudden, violent jerk. Cormac, who was sitting stiffly on the edge of the velvet cushion trying to maintain a formal posture, completely lost his balance. He pitched forward, his heavy boots tangling in his royal cloak. "Whoa!" he yelled, throwing his massive arms out. He completely bypassed the empty space on the floor and crashed squarely onto the bench beside me, his full weight landing directly on top of my wooden lockbox. There was a deafening crack as the heavy oak splintered entirely in half beneath him. He froze, half sprawled across the velvet, his face inches from my hip. "That," I whispered, closing my eyes and taking a deep, calming breath, "was my loose copper box." 3 hours into the journey, the illusion of the terrifying, stoic Alpha King had completely and utterly dissolved. The road toward the capital was notoriously unmaintained, a winding dirt path heavily scarred by wagon wheels and recent spring floods. The gilded carriage, despite its expensive leather suspension, was being tossed around like a rowboat in a squall. Every rut in the road sent a violent shudder through the velvet interior. And Cormac was losing his mind. He was sitting rigidly in the corner of his bench, his massive arms crossed tightly over his chest, staring fixedly at a gold tassel hanging from the carriage roof. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles ticked in his cheek, but all the forced brooding in the world couldn't hide the fact that his normally tanned complexion had turned a delicate shade of pale green. "You are breathing entirely too hard," I noted, bracing my boots against the floorboards as the carriage hit another jarring pothole. "I am breathing," he ground out, not breaking eye contact with the tassel, "exactly as a king should breathe." "Kings breathe like they are trying to suck all the air out of a small cavern?" I asked smoothly. "It is a commanding breath," he insisted, though his voice lacked any real command. A particularly vicious bump sent him sliding 2 inches to the left. He gripped the edge of the velvet cushion with white-knuckled desperation. "You're carriage-sick," I said, a slow, malicious grin spreading across my face. "I am a shifter of the royal bloodline," he snapped, finally glaring at me. "My biology is flawless. I do not get sick from a slow trot through the woods." "You look like a piece of boiled asparagus," I countered. "It's fine. It happens to the best of us. Your inner ear is just violently confused because you're sitting still while the world is moving. My inner ear is perfectly calibrated." The carriage slammed into a dip, pitching violently to the right. Cormac dropped his head into his massive hands, letting out a pitiful, muffled groan that sounded distinctly unroyal. I sighed, reached under the bench, and hauled out a small, sturdy wooden bucket I had brought for washing dishes on the road. I slid it across the floorboards with the toe of my boot until it clattered against his shin. He peered through his fingers at the bucket, looking deeply betrayed. "What is that?" "It's a bucket, Your Majesty, for the commanding breaths that decide to violently exit your stomach." "I am not going to—" he started, sitting up straight to argue. The carriage hit a rock. He immediately doubled over again, snatching the bucket and holding it desperately against his chest like a shield. "This is incredibly humiliating," he mumbled into the wood. "I am supposed to be intimidating. I am supposed to be establishing dominance." "You are establishing that you shouldn't eat salted pork before a bumpy ride," I said, leaning back against the cushions. I found myself fighting a completely unexpected wave of affection. He was absurd. He was massive and powerful and entirely incapable of keeping his composure in a moving box. It made the electric jolt from earlier feel slightly less terrifying. He wasn't a ruthless conqueror trying to trap me. He was just a guy trying not to ruin the upholstery. "You will not mention this to the council," he ordered, his voice muffled. "My silence will cost you an extra 20 gold pieces." "Extortion," he whispered weakly. "Capitalism," I corrected. Outside, the sky suddenly went dangerously dark. The thick canopy of the forest blocked out the afternoon sun, and the heavy, humid air finally broke. A torrential downpour slammed against the roof of the carriage, sounding like thousands of tiny hammers. "Fantastic," I muttered, shivering as the temperature plummeted. "Mud. This road is going to become a swamp." "The driver knows what he's doing," Cormac said, lowering the bucket slightly, the cool air seeming to help his nausea. "We will just proceed slowly." A crack of thunder shook the ground, instantly followed by a sickening, explosive snap from directly beneath us. The entire carriage violently tilted to the right. I was thrown from my seat, sliding across the velvet as gravity violently reasserted itself. Cormac yelled, reaching out, but the carriage continued to tip, the massive wooden frame groaning in protest as the snapped wheel gave way entirely. With a deafening crash, the royal carriage slammed into the muddy ditch, violently tossing us into the dark. The world stopped spinning, replaced entirely by the sensation of being squashed against something terrifyingly solid. I blinked against the pitch-black interior of the sideways carriage. The torrential rain was hammering against the wooden roof, but inside, all I could hear was heavy, ragged breathing. I was entirely pinned beneath a mountain of velvet, muscle, and the overpowering scent of crushed pine. "Your Majesty," I wheezed, my face smashed somewhere near his collarbone. "If you have crushed my lungs, our contract is void." Cormac groaned, a deep vibrating sound in the dark, and hastily scrambled backward. The carriage groaned ominously. "Are you injured? Lyra, talk to me." "I'm fine," I grumbled, shoving a velvet cushion off my face. "But unless you want to sleep in a sideways box filling with mud, we need to walk." 30 minutes later, we were trudging through the freezing downpour. Cormac had tried to drape his massive royal cloak over me, but it was so heavy it practically dragged me into the mud. I shoved it back at him, preferring the rain to being smothered in wet velvet. We eventually spotted a flickering lantern hanging outside a sagging, miserable structure. The sign, barely hanging on by one rusted nail, read, "The Boar's End." Inside, the innkeeper took one look at Cormac's sheer size, glanced at the heavy gold coin I slammed onto the rotting counter, and handed over an iron key without a single question. Our suite was a disaster. The roof leaked directly into the center of the room. There was no hearth. The floorboards were spongy, and worst of all, there was only one rickety, narrow cot pushed against the far wall. "Absolutely not," I declared, instantly marching to the center of the room. I grabbed a frayed rope holding up a dusty tapestry, ripped it free, and tied it between a ceiling beam and a wall sconce. I threw a damp woolen blanket over the line. "There. A wall. The cot is on my side." Cormac stood dripping by the door, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He looked entirely too large for the room, his broad shoulders practically grazing the hanging blanket. "I am the king. I have commanded armies. And tonight, you command the floorboards," I countered, pulling off my soaked boots. "Good night, sire." I curled onto the cot, shivering violently as the freezing damp seeped into my bones. The rain pounded relentlessly outside. I could hear Cormac shifting uncomfortably on the hard wood, his teeth actually chattering. My logical brain told me to let him freeze. He was an alpha. He would survive. But my inner wolf, the instinct I had spent my entire life suppressing, was pacing frantically in my chest, screaming at me to seek his warmth. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, the freezing damp was gone. I was enveloped in an overwhelming, glorious heat. My face was buried in a solid, broad chest, and a massive arm was wrapped tight around my waist, anchoring me perfectly against him. I inhaled deeply, my wolf letting out a soft, embarrassing purr of absolute contentment against his neck. Then, the inn door exploded inward with a deafening crack. I bolted upright, violently shoving Cormac away. He fell off the narrow cot with a loud thud, completely disoriented, as 3 heavily armed men stepped over the splintered remains of the inn door. "The Lord of the Vale requests your presence!" the lead guard barked, pointing a halberd at us. Cormac slowly rose from the floorboards, brushing dust off his wrinkled royal tunic. He drew himself up to his full, terrifying height, his jaw ticking. "You kicked down my door in the dead of night for a dinner invitation." "Lord Heston insists," the guard sneered, clearly unimpressed by a king staying in a hovel. An hour later, we were sitting at a massive, polished oak table in a stuffy stone keep. Lord Heston was a pompous, balding man who wore far too much velvet and smelled aggressively of cheap rosewater. He spent the first 3 courses bragging about his pure bloodline while practically ignoring Cormac. I was starving, exhausted, and my boots were still wet. My filter was entirely gone. "And this vintage," Heston boasted, swirling a goblet of dark liquid, "was fermented in the northern cellars for a decade. Truly, a drink for civilized nobility." I took a sip. I paused, swishing it around my mouth, before setting the goblet down with a sharp clack. "It tastes like a wet dog rolled in a barrel of rotten plums," I said flatly. The entire dining hall went dead silent. Cormac choked on his venison, quickly covering his mouth with a napkin to hide what looked suspiciously like a grin. Lord Heston turned completely red, his jowls shaking. "Excuse me? You dare insult my cellars? You are nothing but a common tavern wench playing dress-up." "I run a highly profitable trading post," I corrected, leaning back in my chair. "Which means I know that you've been watering down your exports to the capital for 3 years. Your crest is a joke from here to the mountain pass." Heston stood up so violently his chair crashed to the stone floor. "Insolence! Guard! Drag this disrespectful creature to the courtyard. We will see how sharp her tongue is after 10 lashes." 2 guards immediately stepped forward, reaching for my arms. I didn't even have time to reach for my heavy wooden spoon. The heavy oak dining table cracked loudly down the center. Cormac didn't just stand up, he erupted. He moved with a speed that defied his massive frame, intercepting the guards and throwing them backward with a single, brutal sweep of his arm. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even raise his fists. Cormac simply stepped between me and the Lord, his chest heaving. His eyes were no longer human. They were a blinding, terrifying wolf gold. The temperature in the room spiked instantly, the oppressive, suffocating weight of a true alpha rolling through the air like a physical shockwave. "If you," Cormac growled, his voice dropping to a lethally calm, vibrating pitch that made the silverware rattle on the table, "so much as look at my mate again, I will burn this keep to the foundation." We left Heston's keep before sunrise. The carriage had been repaired, but after the violent display at dinner, the atmosphere inside the cabin was thicker than the summer humidity. Cormac had completely retreated back into his awkward, apologetic shell, terrified he had scared me. He sat rigidly, staring at his boots. The problem was, he hadn't scared me. My pulse was still racing and my inner wolf was preening. He had defended me not by commanding me to be quiet, but by threatening a lord for trying to silence me. It was deeply, irritatingly attractive. By midday, our procession was forced to a grinding halt. We had hit the crossroads at Oakhaven, directly in the middle of their chaotic midsummer shifter festival. The streets were choked with merchants, brightly colored tents, and the overwhelming scent of roasting meats, mead, and crushed wildflowers. Because the carriage couldn't fit through the narrow market stalls, we had to walk. Almost immediately, it became a disaster. The local female shifters recognized the royal crest. They didn't see the clumsy man who got carriage-sick. They saw a massive, unmarried alpha king. Women in low-cut bodices began aggressively pushing past the royal guard, dropping curtsies that left nothing to the imagination, and offering Cormac flower crowns and cups of sweet wine. "Oh, your grace," a particularly bold blonde purred, stepping directly in front of him and pressing her hand to his chest. "We are so honored to have such a powerful presence in our village." Cormac looked utterly terrified. "Thank you, I am just passing through. Please mind the horse manure." I watched this exchange from 2 steps behind him, my hands clenching into fists. Logic dictated that I should not care. We were fake dating. But the heavy, suffocating wave of biological jealousy that crashed over me was completely irrational. My inner wolf was practically snarling, clawing at my ribs. Mine. The blonde shifter leaned in closer, fluttering her eyelashes. Perhaps you need someone to show you the private springs, sire? That was it. My brain short-circuited. I bent down, scooped up a massive handful of thick, dark street mud, and marched directly up to Cormac. Before the guards could even react, I slapped my hand flat against the center of his pristine, gold-embroidered royal tunic, smearing the thick sludge downward in a vicious, territorial streak. The blonde gasped and stumbled backward. Cormac froze, staring down at the ruined velvet in complete shock. "He's busy," I snapped at the woman, my voice vibrating with a dark, territorial edge I didn't recognize. I expected Cormac to be furious. I expected him to reprimand me for ruining a priceless garment in public. Instead, he looked from the mud to my fiercely glaring eyes, completely misreading the situation. "You're right," Cormac blurted out, a look of sudden, panicked realization dawning on his face. "This tunic is far too stuffy for a festival. I must look ridiculous." Before I could stop him, he grabbed the collar of his ruined shirt and began violently unlacing it right there in the crowded street, fully intending to strip it off. "Stop!" I shrieked, lunging forward to grab his massive wrists before he could bare his chest to the entire swooning festival crowd. His skin was blazing hot beneath my damp, muddy fingers. "Lyra, it's fine. I don't need the tunic. You are the king," I hissed, my face burning as I practically shoved him backward. I grabbed the edge of his ruined collar and physically dragged him out of the crowded thoroughfare, ducking into the first empty merchant's tent I could find. The heavy canvas flaps fell shut behind us, plunging the small space into dim, suffocating heat. The air inside smelled sharply of dried cardamom and sweet tobacco, but it was immediately overpowered by the thick, dizzying scent of his panic and pure pine. "I was only trying to help," Cormac defended, stumbling slightly as he backed into a wooden center pole. "You were clearly upset by the embroidery." "I don't care about the embroidery," I yelled, throwing my hands up in sheer exasperation. The space was entirely too small. He was taking up all the air. "I care about the fact that every woman out there was staring at you like you were a roasted pig on a spit, and my completely irrational inner wolf decided to mark you with street mud like a feral badger." Cormac froze. His chest stopped heaving. In the shadowed tent, his eyes caught the sliver of sunlight slipping through the canvas, flashing that brilliant, terrifying gold. You were claiming me?" "No," I lied instantly, pointing a trembling finger at his chest. I stepped closer, entirely forgetting my fear of his size. My finger poked hard against the solid muscle of his sternum. "It is biology. It is a biological glitch. We have a contract, sire. We are ignoring the wolves. We are ignoring the pulling. We are ignoring—" "I don't want to ignore it," he whispered, his voice suddenly dropping an octave. He didn't move away from my accusing finger. Instead, he leaned into it. The clumsy, apologetic man vanished entirely, replaced by the sheer magnetic gravity of a true mate. He stepped into my space, his broad chest lightly brushing against my extended hand. My breath hitched. The air between us cracked with a heavy electric tension that made my skin flush violently. "Lyra," he murmured, tilting his head down. His gaze dropped to my lips. "I am struggling, very hard, to ignore it." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I couldn't step back. I didn't want to step back. Slowly, agonizingly, I tilted my chin up. He leaned in, his heavy, warm breath fanning across my cheek. Our lips were a millimeter apart. I closed my eyes, entirely surrendering to the pull. A loud, aggressive munching sound echoed in the quiet tent. We both snapped our eyes open. A gray, wiry festival goat had wandered under the canvas flap. It was happily chewing on the corner of the royal fake dating parchment, which was sticking halfway out of Cormac's coat pocket. The goat ate the indemnity clause before Cormac could wrestle the slobbery parchment out of its mouth. We spent the rest of the carriage ride in absolute, agonizing silence, avoiding eye contact while the tension in the cabin practically hummed. By the time we stopped at a sprawling noble estate just outside the capital, My nerves were completely frayed. The estate staff immediately separated us. I was practically herded by a group of terrifyingly polite maids into a lavish guest chamber for proper court fittings. The transition from the muddy road to this stifling silk-draped room made my chest tight. "Just a bit tighter, madam," the royal seamstress cooed, hauling backward on a pair of thick silk laces. "I cannot breathe," I gasped, gripping the edge of the dressing screen. The corset was woven with actual whalebone, locking my ribs into a rigid, agonizing cage. "A queen does not need to breathe deeply," the seamstress dismissed, pulling again. "She only needs to look regal. Now hold still while we attach the ruffled collar." "If you put a ruffle on my neck," I warned, my voice raspy, "I will bite you." "Madam, this is the fashion of the capital. You cannot arrive looking like a feral tavern maid." She reached for a massive, suffocating layer of heavy crushed velvet. The restriction finally broke me. The tight corset, the stuffy room, the terrifying reality of the capital closing in on me. My panic spiked. I violently twisted away, knocking a velvet stool over. I spun around, grabbed the heavy iron fabric shears off the tailoring table and defensively pointed them at the approaching dress. "Stay back," I ordered, my chest heaving against the vicious corset. "I am not wearing that. I am not a doll," the seamstress shrieked, dropping the velvet and backing against the wall. "Guards, help!" The heavy oak door to the chamber exploded inward. Cormac burst into the room, his eyes wild, having clearly heard the shouting. "Lyra, what is—" He stopped dead in his tracks. I was standing in the center of the room, my messy hair tumbling over my bare shoulders. The corset, though agonizing, pushed my cleavage up high, and the partially draped silk skirt clung to my hips in a way that my heavy wool work dresses never did. I was holding massive iron shears like a dagger, completely out of breath. Cormac stared at me. His jaw went entirely slack. He didn't blink. He simply forgot how to function. "I am not wearing the ruffles," I breathed aggressively. He took a step forward, completely mesmerized, his eyes dark with a sudden, heavy heat. "You are," he whispered, entirely breathless. "You are magnificent." He kept walking forward, not looking where he was going. With a sickening thud, the king of the realm walked face first into a solid marble support pillar. Cormac had a highly unregal red mark on his forehead when the carriage finally passed through the towering iron gates of the royal capital. I stared out the window, my defensive bravado melting into cold dread. The castle was an architectural nightmare of jagged spires and looming stone walls, perched aggressively on a cliff overlooking a massive, sprawling city. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a very expensive cage. "They are just people," Cormac whispered, sitting beside me. He didn't try to touch me, but the sheer proximity of his shoulder offered a strange, grounding comfort. Awful people, but just people. When the carriage doors opened in the main courtyard, the atmosphere hit me like a physical blow. Hundreds of courtiers dressed in blinding silks and ridiculous, oversized hats were gathered in perfect formation. They didn't cheer. They simply stared, their eyes sharp and calculating. I stepped out of the carriage, ignoring the footmen, my boots clicking sharply against the polished cobblestones. A man dripping in gold chains and an aggressive amount of powdered perfume stepped out from the front row. Duke Reginald. He bowed, but his eyes stayed fixed on my face with open disdain. "Welcome, Your Majesty," the Duke sneered, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. He looked me up and down. "And welcome to whatever this is. We were unaware the king had developed a taste for charity cases." A smattering of polite, cruel laughter rippled through the nobility. Cormac's chest rumbled with a warning growl, but before he could step forward, I held up my hand. I looked the Duke up and down, taking in his powdered wig and heavily corseted waist. "And we were unaware the royal court had instituted a tax on basic hygiene. Tell me, Duke, do you bathe in the perfume to mask the scent of your own political decay? Or is it just a personal preference?" The courtyard went deathly silent. The Duke's powdered face turned a furious, blotchy purple. He opened his mouth to sputter a response but couldn't find a single word. I gave him a perfectly pleasant, razor-sharp smile. I had handled drunken mercenaries. I could handle men in tight pants. Cormac stepped up beside me, radiating immense, silent pride. "Enough," a reedy voice called out. The head counselor, the same sour-faced man from my trading post, slithered to the front of the crowd, clutching a scroll of parchment. He offered me a deeply malicious smirk. "The king has made his choice, however unorthodox," the counselor announced loudly. "But until the mating is formally recognized by the ancient rites, tradition must be upheld to ensure the purity of the bond." My stomach dropped. What tradition? The counselor's smirk widened. "The unbonded mate is strictly forbidden from entering the king's quarters. You, madam, will be residing in the Omega Wing, located on the absolute opposite side of the fortress." I stared at the counselor, processing his smug proclamation. A flock of aristocratic ravens waited eagerly for my public humiliation. "The Omega Wing," I repeated, my voice unnervingly flat. "Does it have a reinforced steel door, a moat, and a clear line of sight for a crossbow?" The counselor blinked, his sneer faltering. "A crossbow? No, madam. It is a sanctuary of quiet reflection." "Then it is a security risk, and I am not sleeping there," I stated, picking up my heavy wool skirts. I completely turned my back on the entire royal court, marched past the stunned guards, and strode directly up the massive stone steps into the main keep. I didn't know where Cormac's rooms were, but I simply followed the towering, heavily armored knights who scrambled to escort their abruptly moving monarch. Cormac matched my furious pace, his massive strides eating up the cavernous, echoing hallways. The castle smelled of old wax, damp stone, and centuries of arrogant entitlement. When we finally reached a set of towering oak doors carved with snarling wolves, I pushed inside, grabbed a ridiculously heavy gargoyle-carved reading chair, and dragged it directly under the iron door latch. Thud. I dusted off my hands, breathing hard. Cormac stood in the center of the lavish, fur-draped antechamber. He wasn't glaring. He wasn't asserting dominance. His broad chest was vibrating with suppressed, silent laughter. "You just barricaded us in the royal suite." "I am protecting my assets," I snapped, gesturing broadly to myself. "We have a contract. I don't get paid if I get assassinated by a man wearing powdered wig." Before he could respond, a sharp, authoritative knock rapped against the heavy wood. I didn't move the chair. "Enter," Cormac called out. The door pushed inward, scraping harshly against my barricade before wedging open just enough for a woman to slip through. The air instantly chilled. She was breathtakingly polished, wrapped in sleek silver silk that moved like water. Her icy blonde hair was pinned in an elaborate crown, and she smelled aggressively of frozen lilies and sheer arrogance. This was Duchess Genevieve. She took one look at the chair barricade, her perfectly arched eyebrow twitching in disdain, before turning her cold eyes to me. "Cormac, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I heard the commotion in the courtyard. The entire council is in an absolute uproar over your fascinating new acquisition." "Genevieve," Cormac said, his tone instantly dropping into an unreadable, guarded rumble. "This is Lyra." Genevieve circled me slowly, her predatory gaze raking over my mud-stained boots, my messy hair, and the completely unlaced bodice of my travel gown. She stopped, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How remarkably rustic," the Duchess murmured, tilting her chin up. "I suppose every king needs a quaint, temporary frontier experiment to get the wild out of his blood before he settles into a proper civilized mating." A hot, vicious spike of pure fury shot straight through my veins. My eyes darted to the side table, my hand wrapped around the stem of a heavy, solid silver decorative goblet. I gripped it tight, my knuckles turning stark white, calculating exactly how much force it would take to dent royal silver against a duchess's skull. Cormac's hand clamped over mine before I could swing. His palm was blazing hot against my icy skin, his massive fingers entirely swallowing my hand and the silver goblet. "The king's blood is perfectly fine," Cormac stated coldly, stepping squarely between Genevieve and me. And Lyra is not an experiment. Now, if you will excuse us. Oh, I wouldn't dream of intruding, Genevieve interrupted smoothly, stepping back. But tradition dictates the king must meet with the generals, and the queen-elect must join the ladies of the court in the sunroom. Unless she doesn't know how to hold a needle? The challenge hung in the air. Refusing meant proving her right. 20 minutes later, I was trapped in a suffocating lavender-scented parlor, surrounded by 8 noblewomen who stared at me like I was a rabid raccoon that had wandered indoors. I was violently stabbing a silver needle into a wildly expensive silk tapestry. Stab, pull, stab. You are using a remarkably aggressive tension, madam, a viscountess noted, wincing as I yanked the gold thread tight enough to pucker the silk canvas. It secures the foundation, I lied, aggressively jabbing the needle again. I was supposed to be stitching a majestic willow tree. It currently looked like a squashed cabbage. The double doors swung open. Cormac strode in, looking incredibly desperate to rescue me from the hostile silence. He had ditched the heavy velvet cloak, wearing only a tailored leather tunic that showcased the terrifying breadth of his shoulders. The noblewomen immediately gasped and dropped their eyes in performative submission. Lyra, he said, zeroing in on me. The generals are dismissed. Let us leave. Gladly, I muttered, standing up so fast my chair wobbled. Cormac stepped forward to offer his arm. In his sheer relief to get me out of the room, he completely misjudged the distance to the embroidery frame. His heavy boot caught the edge of the wooden stand. He pitched forward, his arm flailing. His hand caught the edge of my ruined silk tapestry. With a horrific, echoing R.I.P., the massive wooden frame crashed to the floor, tearing the priceless silk completely in half as the king of the realm took down a side table of teacups in his wake. The room exploded into shrieks of horror. In the absolute chaos of porcelain shattering and women panicking, a cold hand clamped onto my wrist. Genevieve leaned in close, her icy lily scent suffocating me. Her lips brushed my ear. Do you honestly think he is this clumsy? She whispered, her voice a venomous hiss beneath the noise. He's an alpha, Lyra. Every misstep is calculated. He plays the fool to lower your defenses. Once the ceremony is complete, he drops the act, and he forces the dominance ritual. You won't be a queen. You'll be a broken pet. Genevieve's lie felt like a physical knife twisting between my ribs. My lungs tightened. The walls of the castle suddenly felt an inch thick, closing in on me. As Cormac hastily apologized to the shrieking viscountess and dragged me out of the parlor, my mind was racing. Was it an act? Could a predator that massive truly be that uncoordinated? Or was I walking blindly into a trap? We need air, Cormac declared, completely oblivious to my internal spiraling. The menagerie. No courtiers go there before dusk. The royal menagerie was a sprawling, glass-domed greenhouse attached to the southern wall. The air inside was thick, incredibly humid, and heavy with the scent of crushed ferns, damp earth, and exotic orchids. We wandered down a winding gravel path. I kept a solid 2 feet of distance between us, my arms crossed defensively. I cannot believe I destroyed an ancestral tapestry, he groaned, rubbing the back of his neck. I am a walking disaster. You must think I am entirely incapable of protecting you. I swallowed hard, looking at his broad back. He plays the fool to lower your defenses. Before I could answer, a blood-curdling screech echoed through the greenhouse. A massive bird with iridescent blue feathers and a terrifyingly sharp beak dropped from a low-hanging branch directly into our path. It fanned out a massive, aggressive tail of eye spots and hissed. Is that a peacock? I asked, taking a hesitant step back. Do not look it in the eye, Cormac warned, his voice tight. They are notoriously ill-tempered. The bird shrieked again and charged. Run! Cormac yelled. All royal dignity vanished. We sprinted down the gravel path, the demonic bird snapping its beak mere inches from Cormac's boots. He grabbed my hand, hauled me down a narrow side corridor, and shoved us both through a heavy wooden door, slamming it shut, just as claws scratched violently against the wood outside. Pitch black. We were crammed into a tiny storage closet. It smelled intensely of dry grain, dust, and his overwhelming, blazing heat. The space was so small my back was pressed flat against the door, and his massive chest was hovering a fraction of an inch from mine. We were both panting heavily in the dark. Every inhale expanded his chest, brushing the stiff fabric of his leather tunic against my sensitive collarbone. The physical proximity was agonizing. "This is ridiculous," Cormac whispered breathlessly, his voice vibrating in the tight space. His head dipped down, his warm breath ghosting over the shell of my ear. I couldn't move. My pulse was hammering in my throat. "The bird?" "No," he murmured, his hands rising to rest flat against the door on either side of my head, trapping me completely in the dark. The heat radiating off him was intoxicating, melting my logical defenses. Us, the pretending. I hate this fake contract, Lyra. I want it over with. I want to end the charade. My heart stopped. Once the ceremony is complete, he drops the act. The suffocating panic returned, colder and sharper than before. He didn't want a partner. He was tired of playing the bumbling fool. He wanted his submissive queen. "I want to end the charade," he whispered in the dark. My blood ran entirely ice cold. Once the ceremony is complete, he drops the act. "Get away from me," I gasped, shoving both of my hands violently against the unyielding muscle of his chest. I fumbled blindly behind me, my fingers finally catching the iron latch of the closet. I yanked it down, threw my shoulder against the heavy wood, and tumbled out into the dimly lit corridor, leaving the demonic peacock trapped inside with him. I didn't stop running. I tore down the stone hallways, my chest heaving, desperately trying to escape the suffocating weight of my own panic. The castle felt like a tomb. A massive crack of thunder shook the floorboards as a severe summer storm finally broke over the capital, plunging the corridors into shadowed darkness. I ducked through a set of towering arched doors to escape a patrolling guard, slamming them shut behind me. The royal archives, the massive cavernous library smelled intoxicatingly of ancient paper, binding glue, and ozone from the storm outside. Before I could even catch my breath, the doors wrenched open again. Cormac stepped into the library. His leather tunic was completely disheveled, and his chest was rising and falling in harsh, rapid breaths. His eyes were entirely wolf gold, piercing through the dim light of the lightning strikes. "Lyra," he started, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Do not take another step," I warned, backing up until my spine hit a massive bookshelf. He didn't listen. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, trapping me against the mahogany shelves. The heat radiating off him was scorching, completely overwhelming my senses. He slammed one hand against the wood directly beside my head, leaning in until we were sharing the exact same ragged air. "Why did you run?" he demanded, his voice thick with a raw, primal frustration. "What did I do?" "You played me," I choked out, trying to ignore the way my inner wolf was desperately clawing to surrender to the overwhelming proximity of him. "You act like the bumbling sweet fool, but you just want a tame little pet for your throne? You want to drop the contract and force me into submission." "Submission?" he breathed, his eyes widening in sheer confusion. He leaned closer, his nose brushing the sensitive skin beneath my jaw. The electric jolt of his touch sent a violent shudder through my entire body. "Lyra, I don't want you to submit. I want you to burn this entire court down with me." His lips brushed my jawline. A frantic, terrifyingly hot wave of pure spice shot down my spine. I was entirely helpless against the biological pull of my mate. My hands betrayed me, sliding up to grip the thick muscles of his arms. "No," I whimpered, the terrifying vulnerability of actually being loved shattering my last defense. "No. I'm just here for the gold. This is a business transaction, sire." I shoved him hard, ducked under his arm, and sprinted back out into the dark hallway, leaving him standing breathless among the books. My hands were shaking violently as I shoved my practical mud-stained woolen dresses into a canvas satchel. The storm was raging outside the high-arched windows of the royal antechamber, the rain hammering against the glass like a warning. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stay in this viper pit, waiting for the moment his mask slipped completely, and the terrifying, commanding Alpha King took my freedom away forever. I grabbed my heavy accounting ledger, shoving it into the bag, when I heard the low murmur of voices bleeding through the crack in the adjoining door. I froze. It was the head counselor speaking to someone in the hall. "The frontier woman is unpredictable, yes," the counselor sneered, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. "But the king knows what he is doing. Once the bonding ceremony is finalized at midnight, her biological submission will be absolute. The wildness will be completely broken out of her. She will learn her place as a silent, decorative queen." The floor dropped out from under me. Genevieve had been right. It was a trap. The clumsy, apologetic act, the fake dating contract. It was all a meticulously calculated strategy to get a feral, independent woman to lower her guard just long enough to lock the cage. A cold, deadly calm washed over me. My panic completely vanished, replaced by a highly territorial, defensive fury. I slung the heavy satchel over my shoulder, picked up a massive, solid silver serving tray off the side table, and kicked the adjoining door open. A royal guard was stationed at the end of the hall. He turned, his hand dropping to his sword hilt. "Madam, you are not permitted to—" I didn't even slow my stride. I swung the heavy silver tray like a battle axe, catching him squarely in the chest plate with a deafening clang. He gasped, stumbling backward into the stone wall and sliding down in a stunned heap. "I am checking out early," I announced to the unconscious man. I slipped down the servants' staircase, completely avoiding the main courtyard, and emerged into the muddy, rain-drenched royal stables. I didn't have time to saddle a proper warhorse. I grabbed the reins of the first animal I saw, a remarkably fat, notoriously stubborn gray mule that the stable boys used for hauling feed. "Move!" I hissed, scrambling onto the creature's bare back, my skirts hiking up to my knees. The mule let out a highly uncooperative snort, but a loud crack of thunder spurred it forward. I kicked my heels into its sides, completely abandoning my dream inn, the gold, and the terrifying, intoxicating Alpha King. I fled the capital into the freezing, torrential night, choosing a lonely, muddy freedom over a gilded cage. My grand, dramatic escape was moving at approximately 3 miles an hour. The rain was coming down in blinding, freezing sheets, turning the royal road into a treacherous river of thick mud. The fat gray mule, whom I had furiously dubbed Barnaby II, refused to move faster than a disgruntled, swaying waddle. "Please," I begged, shivering violently as my wool dress soaked completely through, clinging heavily to my legs. "If you trot, I will feed you the finest imported oats for the rest of your miserable life." Barnaby II simply chewed on the leather bit and stopped completely in the middle of the road. "You have to be kidding me," I groaned, aggressively wiping the freezing rain out of my eyes. I was exactly 3 miles past the outer gates. The forest canopy above me was pitch black, violently thrashing in the storm. I tugged the reins, but the mule planted its hooves stubbornly in the mud. Then, the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. The air pressure shifted. The frantic sound of the rain hitting the leaves was suddenly drowned out by a low, vibrating, utterly terrifying growl that rattled the marrow in my bones. I looked up. A massive, pitch-black wolf dropped silently from the high branches of an oak tree, landing squarely in the center of the muddy road, completely blocking my path. He was the size of a draft horse. His fur was soaked, clinging to slabs of terrifying muscle, and his eyes burned with a blinding, lethal gold in the dark. Barnaby II let out a terrified bray, violently bucked and threw me straight backward into the freezing mud. I hit the ground hard, gasping for air as the breath was knocked from my lungs. I scrambled backward, my hands sinking into the freezing sludge, expecting the beast to tear my throat out. The massive wolf stalked forward, its jaw snapping loudly. But then, right before my eyes, the monstrous form shifted, bone and muscles seamlessly snapping and reforming in the blink of an eye. Cormac rose from the mud. He wasn't wearing his royal robes. He wasn't wearing the velvet cloak or the ridiculous embroidery. He was dressed only in soaked, torn trousers, his broad, scarred chest completely bare to the freezing rain. There was absolutely nothing clumsy or awkward about him now. He looked like an apex predator stripped of his cage. His chest heaved violently, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He glared down at me, drenched in the storm, and he looked absolutely devastatingly furious. "You ran!" he roared, his voice slicing straight through the thunder. "You ran!" he roared, his voice slicing straight through the deafening crack of thunder. I scrambled backward in the freezing muck, my hands sinking deep into the thick, freezing sludge. The rain was coming down in blinding, diagonal sheets, plastering my ruined wool dress to my skin and matting my hair across my eyes. I couldn't see the capital behind me. I couldn't see the trading post ahead of me. I could only see him, a massive, furious silhouette of sheer, unadulterated apex predator. "Stay away from me!" I screamed back, completely abandoning logic. I scooped up a massive handful of heavy, wet mud and hurled it directly at his chest. It hit his bare, scarred pectoral muscle with a pathetic smack, instantly washing away in the torrential downpour. He didn't even flinch. He didn't blink. He just kept stalking forward, his bare feet sinking into the treacherous mud, his eyes burning with a lethal, blinding gold in the pitch-black forest. "I gave you my word!" Cormac bellowed, closing the distance between us in 3 terrifyingly long strides. He stopped mere inches from where I was sitting in the mud, towering over me like a vengeful storm god. The heat radiating off his soaked skin was entirely unnatural. It was the raw, blazing furnace of a shifter in absolute emotional freefall. "I signed a contract. I gave you my protection. And you steal a notoriously ill-tempered pack mule to flee into a thunderstorm? I don't want your protection!" I yelled, violently shoving myself up from the ground. I didn't care that he was 1.5 feet taller than me. I didn't care that he could snap a wooden wagon wheel with his bare hands. I closed the distance, jabbing a filthy, trembling finger aggressively into the center of his chest. "I heard them. I heard the counselor. I know exactly what you are planning, sire." Cormac froze. The dangerous primal fury in his eyes flickered, replaced instantly by utter bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" "The ceremony." I shoved him again, though it felt like trying to push a solid granite boulder. "The midnight bonding. The grand plan to tame the wild frontier woman? You think you can play the bumbling, carriage-sick fool just long enough to get my guard down? You think I am going to let you lock me in a cage and turn me into a silent, decorative little pet to sit beside your throne?" The rain hammered against us, heavy and relentless, washing the mud from his face. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at me. The golden light in his eyes slowly faded, leaving only a devastating, entirely human devastation in his dark irises. "You think," he breathed, his voice suddenly breaking, dropping an octave beneath the roaring storm. "You think this was an act? Genevieve told me exactly what you are. Genevieve is a parasite," Cormac erupted, completely shattering whatever remained of his composed royal facade. He didn't roar this time. He sounded entirely, brutally broken. He dragged both of his massive hands through his soaked hair, pulling at the roots. "Do you honestly think I want a silent pet? Do you think I want a woman who bows to me? Lyra, look at me. Look at me." He dropped his hands, gesturing wildly to his own soaked, trembling frame. "I am a disaster," he screamed into the rain, his broad chest heaving. "I am uncoordinated. I am terrified of my own counsel. I get violently nauseous in moving vehicles, and I cannot walk through a room without destroying priceless ancestral artifacts. I am not a conqueror, Lyra. I am an absolute fraud, and I have spent this entire miserable journey entirely terrified that the moment you realized how spectacularly inadequate I am, you would pack your ledgers and leave me." I stood entirely frozen in the mud. The freezing rain was forgotten. The panic in my chest completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming shock. He wasn't trying to cage me. He was terrified he wasn't good enough to keep me. I started, my voice failing me. You aren't trying to tame me? I want you to terrorize my court, he confessed wildly, taking a desperate step forward. The space between us vanished. He reached out, his massive, scorching hands gently framing my freezing, mud-streaked face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones, his touch unbelievably reverent for a man of his size. I want you to threaten the nobility with your heavy wooden spoons. I want you to manage my chaotic life. I don't want a subject, Lyra. I want a partner who isn't afraid to yell at me when I am being an idiot. My breath hitched. The walls I had spent my entire life building, the sarcasm, the fierce independence, the terror of vulnerability, crumbled into dust under his calloused fingertips. I am going to yell at you a lot, I whispered, my voice trembling as I looked up into his eyes. I am counting on it, he breathed. He didn't wait for permission. He leaned down, and I surged up onto my toes. The kiss was desperate, frantic, and entirely unpolished. There was no royal decorum. It tasted like rainwater, mud, and overwhelming relief. I tangled my cold hands into his soaked hair, pulling him closer, anchoring myself against the solid, unyielding heat of his chest. My inner wolf practically howled in triumph, completely surrendering to the bond. He wrapped his arms around my waist, lifting me effortlessly out of the mud, crushing me against him as the thunderstorm raged around us. We stayed like that until we were both breathless. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, his chest rising and falling heavily against my own. So, I panted, swiping a muddy thumb across his lower lip. We are going back. We are going back, Cormac confirmed, a new, dangerous smile curving his mouth. And we are going to make them deeply regret ever speaking to you. The grand iron gates of the royal capital were usually locked at midnight. They were not designed to be kicked open by a barefoot, shirtless alpha king, completely covered in forest mud. The two heavily armored gate guards practically tumbled over themselves in terror as Cormac strode through the entrance, entirely bypassing the usual security protocols. He didn't shout commands. He didn't even look at them. He just kept walking, his massive hand securely engulfing mine, his thumb drawing slow, grounding circles against my knuckles. I was a complete disaster. My heavy wool dress was soaked with freezing rain and caked in sludge up to the knees. I had lost one boot somewhere near Barnaby II. My hair was a tangled, wild nest. But as we marched across the pristine, moonlit cobblestones of the royal courtyard, I had never felt more invincible. We didn't head for the side entrances or the servant quarters. Cormac led me directly up the sweeping marble staircase toward the great hall, leaving a trail of filthy, squelching footprints on the priceless white stone. The heavy oak doors of the council chambers were already open. Inside, the room was a chaotic blur of panicked nobility. Courtiers in hastily donned silk robes and powdered wigs were shouting over one another. The head counselor was standing near the throne, furiously waving a rolled parchment while Duchess Genevieve stood off to the side looking entirely too smug. When we crossed the threshold, the silence that fell over the room was so sudden it felt physical. Every single head snapped toward us. The smell of our entrance, ozone, wet earth, and the raw, heavy, undeniable scent of a fully bonded alpha pair completely suffocated the delicate perfumes of the room. The head counselor's jaw practically unhinged. He stared at Cormac's bare, scarred chest, then dropped his gaze to our joined hands. Sire, I found her, Cormac announced, his voice a low, lethal rumble that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He didn't drop my hand. He pulled me half a step forward so we were standing shoulder to shoulder, a completely unified front. This is an outrage! Duke Reginald sputtered, stepping out from the crowd, his powdered wig slightly askew. Look at her! She is feral! She has tracked literal swamp water onto the ancestral carpets. The contract was a temporary measure. You cannot seriously intend to bring this frontier menace into the permanent line of succession. I didn't reach for a ledger. I didn't reach for a silver tray. I didn't have to. Duke Reginald, I said, my voice cutting through the hall with terrifying clarity. I offered him a sharp, entirely bloodless smile. I would be very careful about critiquing my footwear. The last time a man insulted me in this castle, he woke up with a concussion behind the stables. A horrified gasp rippled through the gathered ladies. Genevieve stepped forward, her icy facade cracking slightly. Cormac, you cannot allow her to speak to the nobility this way. She has no decorum. She is entirely unsuited for the crown. She is entirely suited for me, Cormac corrected instantly. He turned his head, looking down at me with such raw, undisguised adoration that several courtiers actually looked away in discomfort. And anyone who questions her place in this court questions my own. The head counselor stepped forward, his eyes narrowing maliciously. He unrolled the heavy parchment in his hands. Very well, sire. If she is to be your permanent mate, then the ancient laws must be upheld. The law of the founders is absolute. What law? Cormac demanded, his posture instantly stiffening. The midnight rite of submission, the counselor declared, his voice ringing with smug triumph. To ensure the safety of the realm, a wild mate must publicly demonstrate absolute obedience to the Alpha King. She must walk 10 paces behind you into the great sanctuary. She must kneel at the altar. She must offer her throat, and she must swear a vow of eternal silence in matters of state. If she refuses to complete the ceremony before the moon sets tonight, she is legally exiled from the capital forever. The room held its breath. The trap was set. They knew I would never kneel, and they knew Cormac wouldn't force me. It was a perfect legal maneuver to get rid of me. Genevieve smirked. Cormac's hand tightened around mine. His eyes flashed gold, his chest rumbling with a genuine, terrifying growl. I will disband the council. I will burn that parchment right here on the floor. No, I interrupted softly. Cormac looked at me in shock. Lyra, you are not kneeling to anyone. I won't allow it. I squeezed his hand, looking up at his panicked, beautiful face. I didn't feel trapped. For the first time since I arrived in this miserable castle, I felt entirely in control. I looked back at the counselor, my smile widening into something truly wicked. A public ceremony? I asked, raising an eyebrow. With the entire court in attendance? Every lord and lady, the counselor confirmed, looking highly suspicious of my calm demeanor. Perfect, I said, dropping Cormac's hand to link my arms smoothly through his, ignoring the wet mud currently soaking into his trousers. I looked up at the king of the realm. Sire, I believe we have a wedding to attend. Let's go ruin a tradition. The great sanctuary smelled entirely of suffocating incense and ancient dust. Hundreds of courtiers were crammed into the wooden pews, their eyes wide and horrified as we entered. The high priest, a remarkably ancient man draped in heavy silver robes, stood at the marble altar, clutching a ceremonial dagger and a white silk ribbon. The rite begins, the high priest called out, his voice cracking. The unbonded female shall walk 10 paces behind the alpha, demonstrating her deference to his shadow. Cormac didn't take a single step forward. Instead, he stopped at the heavy wooden doors, looked down at me, and offered his arm. I linked my arm through his. Together, completely ignoring the horrified gasps of the nobility, we walked down the center aisle shoulder to shoulder. We didn't walk slowly. We marched, our boots, well, my one boot and his bare feet, smacking loudly against the pristine marble. Halt! The high priest sputtered as we reached the altar entirely unified. This is highly irregular. She must be behind you. She is right where she belongs, Cormac stated flatly. Proceed with the next ridiculous step, priest. The high priest looked like he was going to have a medical emergency. His hands shook as he lifted the white silk ribbon. The female shall present her wrists. The alpha shall bind her, proving his absolute ownership over her freedom. Cormac took the white ribbon from the trembling man. He didn't look at my wrists. He looked into my eyes. With a slow, entirely deliberate movement, Cormac wrapped one end of the silk ribbon around his own thick wrist, tying a tight knot. Then, he offered the loose end to me. I took the silk, wrapped it securely around my own wrist, and tied it off. We were bound to each other. Equal footing. Equal restriction. Someone in the second pew actually whimpered in distress. I think it was Duke Reginald. "Now," I prompted the priest, leaning casually against the altar. "What's next? Do I kneel?" Yes," the priest stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the floor. "You kneel, and you offer your throat, and you swear the vow of silence." "I am going to pass on the kneeling," I announced brightly. I turned to face Cormac, the ribbon pulling taut between us. The heavy electric tension that had been building since the trading post suddenly spiked, flooding the cold sanctuary with an overwhelming, suffocating heat. The political theater fell away. It was just him. "I, Lyra of the Southern Pass," I said, my voice ringing clear and completely uncompromising in the silent room. "Do not swear silence. I swear to be the loudest problem this court has ever seen. I swear to protect your flanks, audit your absolutely terrible royal ledgers, and catch you when you trip over your own capes." Cormac let out a breathless, broken laugh, his eyes shining in the candlelight. "And I, Cormac," he answered, his voice dropping into that low, vibrating rumble that made my knees weak, "swear to belong entirely to you. No cages, no contracts, just us." "This is invalid," the head counselor shrieked from the front row. "The law dictates she must submit. The bond is not recognized." Cormac didn't even look at him. He stepped forward, cupping the back of my neck with his massive, scorching hand. "Let's finalize the bond." He kissed me. It wasn't a polite ceremonial peck. It was a deep, consuming, entirely shameless claiming right in front of the altar. The biological spark that we had been fighting for weeks finally ignited into a roaring inferno. My inner wolf slammed against his, the bond snapping into place with a physical jolt that actually made the candles on the altar flicker wildly. I tangled my fingers in his dark hair, pulling him closer, completely lost in the overwhelming scent of pine and rain. When we finally broke apart, the entire sanctuary was dead silent. Genevieve looked like she was going to be sick. Cormac turned his head, his eyes glowing a terrifying, dominant gold as he stared down the counselor. "The king is bonded. The ceremony is over. If anyone knocks on my chamber door before noon tomorrow, I will personally throw them off the battlements." He didn't wait for a response. He scooped me up into his arms, completely ignoring my ruined, muddy dress, and carried me directly out of the sanctuary. The walk to the royal chambers was a blur of frantic, breathless anticipation. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind us, the iron latch dropping with a definitive clack. The room was boiling hot, the massive hearth roaring with a fresh fire. Cormac let me slide down his chest until my feet hit the thick fur rug. "No more running," he murmured, his hands already dropping to the laces of my ruined bodice, his touch completely stripped of all hesitation. "No more acting," I breathed back, pushing the torn leather tunic off his massive shoulders. The last of our defenses fell away, leaving nothing but the raw, unpolished, entirely undeniable truth of what we were to each other. The heavy fur rug was a complete disaster. We lay tangled in the center of the royal chambers, bathed in the soft, bruised light of early dawn. The fire in the massive stone hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering shadow over the scattered remnants of my ruined, muddy dress and Cormac's torn leather tunic. My head rested squarely on his bare chest, the steady, thumping rhythm of his heart beneath my cheek the most grounding sound I had ever heard. The suffocating heat of the mating frenzy had finally settled into a deep, vibrating hum in my blood. Every time I shifted, his heavy arm tightened instinctively around my waist, anchoring me against the solid, unyielding wall of his body. "They are outside," Cormac murmured, his voice rough and thick with sleep. His fingers were lazily tracing the curve of my spine, sending a delicious, lazy shiver down my back. I tilted my head up, resting my chin on his sternum. "Who?" The council, he sighed, burying his face in my messy hair. I can hear Genevieve pacing the corridor. I believe the head counselor is weeping softly into a tapestry. I told them if they knocked before noon, I would throw them off the battlements. It's only dawn, I pointed out, entirely unapologetic. We have 6 hours to pack. Cormac opened one eye, the feral gold completely gone, leaving only that warm, dark iris. Pack? I am not living in this museum, I stated firmly, pressing a kiss to the hollow of his collarbone. The air is stale, the courtiers smell like powdered regret, and I am not leaving my trading post to rot in the mud. I have blueprints, Cormac. We had a deal. A slow, devastatingly wicked smile spread across the king's face. The Grand Inn. You want to build the inn. I want to build an empire, I corrected, sitting up and pulling a heavy velvet sheet over my chest. And I want to do it in the boondocks, where no one wears a bone-crushing corset, and the royal peacocks do not actively try to assassinate you. Cormac sat up, the sheet pooling at his waist, entirely unbothered by his own magnificence. He looked around the opulent, stifling room, and then he looked at me. Lyra, do you know how much a royal throne actually weighs? I assume you are about to find out. 6 months later, the southern frontier smelled entirely of roasting meats, fresh pine sawdust, and sweet spilled ale. The Raven's Library, the sprawling 3-story traveler's inn we had constructed right over the ashes of my old trading post, was completely packed. I had named it for the massive wall of bookshelves holding my ledgers, but the locals just called it the Queen's Court. The tavern floor was a chaotic sea of merchants, weary travelers, and local shifters seeking shelter from the autumn chill. A massive stone hearth blazed at the center of the room, casting a golden, cinematic glow over the polished oak tables. I stood behind the sprawling mahogany bar, a fresh, flower-free apron tied around my waist. The heavy, iron-bound accounting ledger was open in front of me, the columns finally, beautifully balanced. The front door slammed open, letting in a gust of crisp mountain air. Lord Heston, the pompous nobleman who had threatened to lash me 6 months ago, stood in the doorway, looking entirely out of place in his velvet traveling cloak. He spotted me behind the bar, his face turning a blotchy purple, but before he could utter a single word of complaint, a massive shadow fell over him. Cormac emerged from the kitchen, balancing a wooden tray loaded with 6 sloshing tankards of dark ale. He was wearing a simple, well-worn linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to expose his scarred forearms. He didn't look like a distant, brooding conqueror. He looked completely, unapologetically happy. "Ah, Lord Heston," Cormac boomed, offering a bright, entirely terrifying smile that showcased just enough fang to make the nobleman flinch. "Welcome to the frontier. The Queen requires a cover charge for the premium booths." Heston swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between my unbothered smirk and the king of the realm holding a tray of drinks. Your Majesty, you are serving?" "I am actively trying not to drop these," Cormac corrected cheerfully. He took exactly 2 steps toward a nearby table. His boot caught the edge of a slightly raised floorboard. I didn't even blink. I reached across the bar, perfectly timed, and caught the heavy wooden tray just as Cormac pitched forward, completely saving the 6 tankards from flying across the tavern. Cormac caught himself on a structural pillar, letting out a breathless laugh as the tavern erupted into good-natured cheers. "My hero," he breathed, leaning over the mahogany bar. The intoxicating scent of his pine and rain completely drowned out the smell of the tavern. "You are a menace to my glassware," I whispered back, leaning in until our lips brushed. "But I am yours," he murmured against my mouth, completely ignoring the horrified Lord Heston standing 3 feet away. "Yes," I agreed, grabbing his collar and pulling him down for a proper, scorching kiss that made the entire tavern go completely silent. "You are." And for once, my wolf didn't whimper a single word of protest.